Some engines don't fail all at once. Sometimes they wait years before they decide how many lives they're going to take. The Holloway Sentinel SUV exploded at 7:14 on a cold Thursday morning outside Indianapolis. Traffic cameras caught the moment the white vehicle rolled to a stop beneath the overpass, smoke pouring from beneath the hood before the entire engine compartment burst into flames bright enough to freeze 4 lanes of traffic in place. By 8:03, the footage was everywhere. Cable news, TikTok, YouTube. By noon, Holloway Motors had lost $2.8 billion in market value. 300 miles away in the small town of Dunbar, Ohio, Caleb Mercer stood beneath the hood of a rusted Ford pickup with a wrench in one hand and motor oil dark across his knuckles when the television mounted above the waiting area switched from daytime commercials to breaking news. The anchor's voice sharpened instantly. Federal regulators are now investigating whether today's engine failure may be connected to previous incidents involving Holloway Sentinel vehicles. Caleb stopped moving before the sentence finished. For 3 seconds, the garage went completely silent except for the ticking sound of cooling metal. Then his eyes lifted slowly toward the screen. The fire reflected faintly across his face. Not surprise. Recognition. Beside the tool cabinet near the office door, 8-year-old Sophie Mercer sat cross-legged on the concrete floor doing homework with a purple pencil tucked behind one ear. She looked up when she noticed her father stop moving. "Dad." Caleb didn't answer right away. On the television, reporters replayed the footage again. Flames. Smoke. Emergency lights flashing against wet pavement. The same model. The same engine series. Caleb wiped his hands slowly with an old gray rag and walked toward the back hallway of the garage without saying a word. Sophie watched him disappear behind the storage door marked private. The room beyond it smelled like dust, paper, and machine oil. 5 pale blue filing cabinets lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Every drawer carried handwritten labels in black marker. Dates, batch numbers, engine codes, 10 years of records. Caleb stood still for a long moment before opening the top drawer of cabinet 3. Inside sat hundreds of folders packed tight enough to bend at the edges. He pulled one free carefully. HX, 9 thermal failure reports. The first page showed a photograph taken nearly 9 years earlier. Burn damage around the fuel rail assembly. Identical to the footage now playing across every television in America. Caleb stared at the image without blinking. Then he reached deeper into the folder and removed a second item. A sealed internal memo stamped Holloway Motors Confidential. Across the bottom sat a signature in blue ink. Martin Graves. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Not in anger. Something heavier than anger. Exhaustion. Outside, the sound of tires crunching over gravel rolled through the front lot. Sophie stood and looked through the garage window, just as a black SUV pulled up beside the service bay. 2 men stepped out wearing dark jackets with the Holloway Motors logo stitched across the chest. Neither of them smiled. Sophie glanced nervously toward the hallway. "Dad," she called softly. "They're here again." Caleb slid the folder back into the cabinet slowly and shut the drawer with a dull metal click. Then he looked once more at the television mounted in the corner of the storage room, where flames continued rising from the destroyed SUV beneath the Indianapolis overpass. His expression never changed. But for the first time in 10 years, Caleb Mercer looked like a man who already knew something the rest of the country was only beginning to understand. The 2 men from Holloway Motors stayed beside the black SUV while snow drifted lightly across the edge of the parking lot and settled against the cracked pavement outside Mercer Auto Repair. Neither of them walked inside immediately. Caleb noticed that first. Corporate men usually rushed when they believed they still had power. These men looked careful instead. That meant somebody higher up was nervous. Sophie quietly closed her workbook and carried it toward the small office near the coffee machine, while Caleb stepped back onto the garage floor with the same unreadable expression he had worn for years. One of the men finally entered through the service bay door carrying a clipboard that looked untouched by actual work. Mid-30s. Clean boots. Holloway Motors windbreaker zipped all the way to his throat. "Mr. Mercer?" Caleb nodded once. "We are here for the usual pickup." Caleb glanced toward the television, still replaying the Indianapolis footage above the waiting area. The man noticed the screen immediately and looked away too fast. That told Caleb even more. "Engine is in the back," Caleb said calmly. The second man wheeled in a steel cart, and both employees moved toward the storage area without another word. They had done this before, hundreds of times, maybe more. Every month for nearly 10 years, damaged Holloway engines arrived in Dunbar after midnight inside unmarked cargo vans with out-of-state plates. No paperwork, no signatures, just engines wrapped in gray tarps and sealed envelopes containing cash. Caleb had stopped asking questions after the third delivery because by then he already understood exactly what was happening. Holloway Motors was not fixing the defective engines. They were hiding them. The first delivery had happened 11 months after his wife, Nora, died from a sudden illness that emptied his savings account faster than he thought possible. At the time, Caleb had been sleeping 4 hours a night while trying to keep the garage alive and raise a 2-year-old daughter who still woke up crying for her mother. Then one night a delivery truck arrived carrying an engine block Caleb recognized instantly. HX 9 Series. His engine. The design he had spent 4 years building at Holloway Motors before everything in his life collapsed. He remembered standing alone in the garage that night, staring at the cracked fuel assembly beneath fluorescent lights while rain hammered the roof overhead. The failure pattern was impossible to miss. Heat stress near the upper manifold. Weak shielding around the pressure channel. Exactly the defect he had warned management about during prototype testing 12 years earlier. Caleb had written a 73-page report explaining why the engine should never enter mass production without redesign. Martin Graves buried the report too. Weeks later, 3 months after that, Caleb lost his position during a corporate restructuring no one ever explained publicly. Now the same engines kept appearing at his garage one after another like ghosts refusing to stay buried. Caleb walked toward the office doorway, where Sophie sat quietly coloring at the desk. She looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "Are they taking another one?" she asked softly. Caleb nodded. "Yes." "Is it from the same company?" He looked toward the men loading the engine onto the steel cart. "Same company." Sophie hesitated for a moment before lowering her voice even further. "Did they know those engines were bad?" Caleb did not answer immediately. Outside, snowflakes drifted across the windshield of the black SUV while the men secured the damaged engine in silence. Finally, Caleb crouched slightly beside her chair and brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Some people know something is broken," he said quietly. "They just hope it breaks somewhere far away from them." Sophie looked toward the television where reporters continued replaying the highway fire beneath flashing headlines. Then she looked back at her father. But now everybody saw it. Caleb stared at the screen for a long moment. "Yeah," he said softly. Now everybody saw it. 42 floors above downtown Chicago, Vivien Holloway stood in front of a wall of glass, watching snow move between the buildings like drifting smoke, while 3 television screens replayed the same highway footage on silent repeat behind her. Every network had already labeled the failure a disaster. Holloway Motors stock continued falling in real time across the lower ticker at the bottom of the screen. Red numbers, red arrows, red panic. Vivien kept both hands resting lightly against the conference table while executives argued around her as if volume alone could slow the collapse. "One isolated thermal event does not justify a nationwide recall," said Gregory Hale from legal. "If we overreact publicly, we confirm liability before regulators even finish preliminary analysis." "The public already decided," another executive snapped back. "Our customer service centers logged 30,000 calls in the last 2 hours. Vivien said nothing. That silence was what unsettled people most about her. At 38 years old, she had spent nearly a decade building the reputation of a woman who never lost control in a room full of men waiting for her to fail. She did not yell. She did not slam tables. She listened until everyone else exposed exactly how afraid they were. Then she made decisions. That was how Holloway Motors survived recession years, supply chain collapses, union disputes, and foreign competition. But this felt different. This felt structural. Her assistant quietly approached from the side of the room, holding a tablet. "The Department of Transportation wants a statement within the hour." Vivien took the tablet without looking away from the city skyline. "And engineering?" "Still reviewing the Indianapolis vehicle." "Still reviewing," Vivien repeated flatly. The entire country watched that engine catch fire in high definition. "I would prefer a stronger update than still reviewing." Near the far end of the conference table, Martin Graves remained unusually calm. Gray suit, silver tie. hands folded neatly in front of him like a banker waiting for market volatility to pass. He had been with Holloway Motors longer than anyone else in the room, longer than Vivien herself. Her father trusted him once. That mattered more than she liked admitting. "Vivien," Martin said carefully, "we should avoid reacting emotionally before facts are verified." Vivien finally turned toward him. One vehicle failure becomes news. Multiple failures become patterns. Martin did not blink. And patterns can be manufactured by media pressure. For a brief second, the room went still. Vivien studied him closely. She had learned years ago that Martin Graves never wasted words unless he already knew where the conversation was heading. That realization settled heavily in the room like pressure before a storm. "How many similar incidents have we logged internally?" she asked. Martin answered too quickly. "Very few." "How few?" "Single digits." Vivien held his gaze another second longer than comfortable. "I want complete internal reports on every thermal failure, tied to the HX series engines by 5 o'clock. Martin's expression barely shifted. Barely. But she saw it anyway. Tiny movements told larger truths inside boardrooms. "That may take time," he replied. "Then cancel somebody's dinner plans." Vivien turned back toward the television screen where reporters were now interviewing witnesses from the highway incident. A burned vehicle sat beneath flashing emergency lights while snow drifted across the road in slow white waves. The footage should have looked distant. Instead, it felt personal somehow. Familiar. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Who designed the HX-9 platform originally? Several executives exchanged uncertain looks before one younger engineer near the back cleared his throat nervously. A former senior engineer named Caleb Mercer led most of the thermal architecture work over a decade ago. Vivien frowned faintly. Mercer. The name landed somewhere deep in memory. Not clearly, just enough to bother her. "Where is he now?" The room went quiet again. Martin answered this time. "Out of the industry." But 200 miles away in a small garage in Dunbar, Ohio, Caleb Mercer sat alone beside 5 blue filing cabinets, while snow tapped softly against the windows and a television anchor quietly spoke the same words Vivien Holloway had not yet realized were already destroying her company. Investigators now believe the engine failures may have been preventable. Caleb Mercer had not walked into Holloway Motors headquarters in 11 years, but some buildings leave fingerprints on a person long after they are gone. He still remembered the smell of machine oil mixed with expensive coffee in the engineering division. He remembered the sound of polished shoes crossing marble floors while exhausted engineers stared at pressure simulations under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning. Most of all, he remembered the day the HX-9 prototype first overheated during stress testing. Back then, Caleb was 30 years old and considered one of the best thermal systems engineers in the company. Not flashy, not political, but respected in the quiet way competence usually is before corporations begin rewarding performance theater. Instead of actual work, he had built the original cooling architecture for the HX platform almost entirely by hand over 4 years of design revisions and overnight testing cycles. The engine was supposed to become Holloway Motors' future. Faster, lighter, more efficient. Investors loved it before the first vehicle even reached production. Then the failures started. Small at first. Hairline fractures near the fuel assembly during extended heat exposure. Pressure spikes inside the upper chamber after sustained highway speeds. Caleb identified the issue immediately during final testing and filed a recommendation delaying mass production until a redesign could be completed. The redesign would have cost the company nearly $80 million and delayed launch by 14 months. Martin Graves called him into a conference room the next morning. Caleb still remembered the exact time Martin wore that day. Dark blue with silver stripes. "You are overestimating the risk," Martin had said calmly while sliding the report back across the table untouched. "I am reading the data," Caleb answered. Martin smiled the way executives smile when they believe patience itself is authority. Data can be interpreted many ways. Caleb did not raise his voice. "The engine will fail under sustained heat conditions. At statistically insignificant levels. People drive these cars with families inside them." Martin leaned back in his chair slowly. "And thousands of people also depend on this company surviving." The meeting ended without resolution. 2 weeks later, Caleb discovered his report had vanished from internal engineering archives completely. 3 months after that, Nora became sick. Hospital visits replaced engineering meetings. Sleepless nights replaced design reviews. Caleb stopped paying attention to office politics because life outside the company became heavier than anything inside it. By the time Nora passed away the following spring, Holloway Motors had already launched the HX series nationwide. Caleb returned from emergency leave 6 weeks later to discover his security badge no longer opened half the engineering floors. His projects had been reassigned. His name, quietly removed from several internal development records. Nobody explained anything directly. They never do in corporations that large. Human Resources called it restructuring. Martin Graves called it unfortunate timing. Caleb packed his office into 2 cardboard boxes while younger engineers avoided eye contact nearby. One engineer followed him into the parking garage afterward and handed him a folded piece of paper without saying a word. Inside was a photocopy of the deleted thermal failure report Caleb thought had disappeared forever. Across the bottom, someone had handwritten a single sentence in black ink. They buried it. Caleb kept that paper hidden for 11 years. Now it sat inside the top drawer of the blue filing cabinet beside hundreds of newer reports proving the exact same thing over and over again. Back in Chicago, Vivien Holloway stood alone in her office after midnight reviewing archived personnel files on a glowing computer screen while snow drifted beyond the glass skyline outside. Caleb Mercer's employment photo appeared on the monitor beside a list of patents, commendations, and engineering awards tied to the HX platform. Vivien narrowed her eyes slightly as she opened another document. Internal recommendation for delayed production approval. Thermal instability concerns unresolved. Status, archived. Her expression changed slowly as she noticed the timestamp beneath the report. 11 years old. And at the bottom of the approval chain sat the same name appearing across every internal document she had reviewed all evening. Martin Graves. The snow stopped sometime after midnight, but the cold stayed trapped over Dunbar like a lid pressed down across the town. By 6:30 the next morning, Caleb Mercer was already beneath the hood of a delivery van replacing a damaged alternator, while classic rock played softly through an old radio hanging near the workbench. The garage smelled like gasoline, coffee, and winter air leaking through the cracks around the service bay door. Sophie sat at the front counter wearing an oversized gray hoodie while carefully organizing invoices into neat stacks the way she had seen her father do 1,000 times before. She was halfway through labeling receipts when her eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to the storage room. Dad, Caleb tightened one final bolt before looking up. Yeah. Can I ask something? He wiped his hands slowly with a rag. Always. Sophie hesitated. Why did you keep all those files? Caleb glanced briefly toward the back hallway. For a moment, the only sound in the garage came from the ticking radiator beside the office wall. Because memory disappears, he said quietly. Paper does not. Sophie frowned slightly. But if you knew those engines were dangerous, why did you keep fixing them? Caleb leaned against the truck fender without answering immediately. Outside, a school bus rolled past the garage windows, spraying slush across the street. You ever see a crack in a dam? He asked finally. Sophie shook her head. No. Most people only notice it when the wall breaks. Engineers notice it years earlier. Sophie looked down at the invoices in front of her. So you were trying to stop it? Caleb's expression remained calm, but something heavy moved behind his eyes. I was trying to slow it down. Before Sophie could answer, the television above the waiting area interrupted with another breaking news alert. The anchor's voice sharpened immediately. Holloway Motors now faces federal scrutiny after reports reveal at least 11 similar engine fires over the last decade. Caleb turned toward the screen slowly. 11 public cases. That number alone told him how much had stayed hidden. He had documented 73. On television, reporters stood outside Holloway headquarters while stock analysts discussed possible recalls and lawsuits. Then another image appeared briefly on screen. Vivien Holloway exiting the building surrounded by cameras. Calm face, black wool coat, controlled posture. But Caleb noticed something most people would miss. She looked tired. Not physically, structurally. Like somebody beginning to realize the floor beneath them was not solid anymore. Sophie looked toward the screen. Do you think she knew? Caleb stared at Vivien's image for a long moment before answering. I think some people inherit buildings after the cracks already started. At Holloway headquarters, Vivien sat alone inside the executive archive room deep beneath the main tower, while rows of old engineering records surrounded her under fluorescent lighting. Most executives never came down here personally. Too dusty. Too close to the machinery underneath the image of the company. But Vivien kept turning pages anyway. Thermal review memos. Production approvals. Internal audits. The deeper she searched, the more Caleb Mercer's name appeared beside warnings nobody had acted on. She opened another file stamped HX Internal Review and stopped cold. Attached to the back sat a grainy photograph dated 9 years earlier. A small-town garage in Ohio. Crates stacked behind the building beneath a winter tarp. Engine serial numbers visible along the side. Vivien stared at the image as understanding moved slowly across her face. Somebody inside Holloway Motors had known exactly where the defective engines were going all this time. Then she noticed the authorization signature approving the transport route. Martin Graves. Again. Vivien leaned back slowly in the chair while silence settled through the underground archive room. For the first time since the Indianapolis fire, she stopped thinking about public relations entirely. Because suddenly one terrifying possibility became impossible to ignore. Caleb Mercer had not spent 10 years hiding the company's secret. He had spent 10 years documenting it. By Thursday afternoon, Holloway Motors had become the lead story on every major financial network in the country. Analysts who praised the company 3 days earlier now stood beneath bright studio lights discussing damage control, federal investigations, and executive accountability, while stock values continued sliding across giant red screens behind them. Inside Holloway headquarters, nobody walked casually anymore. Assistants moved faster. Phones rang longer. Elevator conversations stopped the moment another employee stepped inside. Fear had entered the building quietly, but now it sat everywhere. Vivien Holloway stood at the far end of the executive boardroom, watching a recall proposal projected across the wall-sized display. While 20 senior executives waited for her decision in complete silence. This covers less than 8% of the affected vehicles, she said flatly. Gregory Hale adjusted his glasses nervously. Those are the units officially connected to reported failures. Vivien turned toward him slowly. Officially connected. Nobody answered. At the center of the table sat Martin Graves with his hands folded exactly the same way Caleb remembered from 11 years earlier. Calm. Precise. Untouched by panic. That calmness bothered Vivien more every hour. We announce a limited recall today, Martin said smoothly. We stabilize public confidence first. Then we expand if necessary. Vivien looked directly at him. And if the failures are not limited? Martin met her eyes without hesitation. Then we manage them as they come. The room stayed silent after that. Not respectful silence. Dangerous silence. Vivien picked up the remote from the table and switched the screen from recall projections to archived internal engineering reports she had reviewed overnight. Dozens of file names appeared instantly. HX thermal instability reports. Pressure failure summaries. Prototype heat variance logs. Every document tied back to one engineer. Caleb Mercer. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Vivien zoomed in on a specific report dated 11 years earlier. Mr. Mercer recommended delaying production before launch due to thermal risks, she said quietly. Who overrode him? Nobody spoke. Martin finally leaned back in his chair. Engineering disagreements happen constantly in automotive manufacturing. Vivien did not look away from him. That was not my question. Another silence. Then Martin gave the smallest possible sigh before answering. The board approved launch unanimously. After your recommendation. After reviewing all available data. Vivien tapped another file open on the display. A transport authorization form appeared. Defective engine routing approval. Destination, Mercer Auto Repair. Dunbar, Ohio. The room changed instantly. Several executives looked visibly confused for the first time all day. Vivien spoke without raising her voice. Can someone explain why defective HX engines were quietly transported to the same independent garage for nearly a decade? Martin's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Third-party repair outsourcing is common. Not without documentation. Those records may be incomplete. Vivien stepped closer to the screen. There are 112 transport authorizations tied to the same location. No one moved. No one even reached for water anymore. Then the youngest engineer in the room cleared his throat carefully. Mercer Auto Repair has one of the highest undocumented parts replacement rates tied to HX warranty claims in the country. Gregory Hale looked confused. How is that possible without triggering federal audits? The engineer swallowed once. Because the failures never officially existed inside the reporting system. Another silence hit the room, heavier this time. Vivien slowly turned toward Martin Graves. You buried the defect. Martin remained seated. I protected this company from collapse. You gambled with people's lives. I saved 30,000 jobs. Vivien stared at him for several long seconds while every executive in the room avoided eye contact completely. Then her assistant entered quickly through the side door holding a tablet with both hands. Ma'am, she said quietly. Another Sentinel engine fire was reported 30 minutes ago outside St. Louis. Nobody spoke after that. The screen reflected across Vivien Holloway's face while snow drifted against the boardroom windows high above Chicago. Then she asked the one question that finally changed the room completely. Has anyone actually spoken to Caleb Mercer? Martin answered immediately. There is no reason to involve him. Vivien looked at him coldly. I think he became the reason 11 years ago. The drive from Chicago to Dunbar took just under 6 hours in winter traffic, but Vivien Holloway spent the entire trip staring through the passenger window in silence while her assistant drove through snow-covered highways stretching across Ohio farmland. She had ignored 17 calls from investors, 4 from legal counsel, and 3 from Martin Graves. By the third voicemail, Martin stopped, sounding calm. That alone told her more than any internal report ever could. The farther they moved away from the city, the smaller everything became. Smaller roads, smaller gas stations, smaller buildings. The world Holloway Motors operated inside suddenly felt very far away from places like this. Vivien noticed old pickup trucks parked beside diners with faded signs and hardware stores that still closed at 6 o'clock. Real places, working places. The kinds of towns corporations only remembered during election years and quarterly advertising campaigns. Dunbar appeared just after sunset beneath pale gray skies and drifting snow. Mercer Auto Repair sat near the edge of town beside an abandoned grain warehouse and a diner with flickering neon lights in the window. No polished glass, no security gate, just a weathered garage with a cracked sign hanging above the bay doors and yellow light glowing softly from inside. Vivien stepped out of the SUV and immediately smelled oil, cold air, and snow. For a brief second, she simply stood there looking at the building while something unfamiliar settled in her chest. Guilt. Inside the garage, Caleb Mercer was tightening bolts beneath the hood of an old Chevrolet pickup while Sophie sat nearby at a folding table finishing math homework beside a bowl of tomato soup. The television, mounted in the corner, continued cycling through news coverage of Holloway Motors in near silence. Caleb looked up the moment the garage door opened. Their eyes met instantly across the room. Vivien expected anger, maybe resentment. Instead, Caleb only looked tired, deeply tired. Sophie noticed the expensive black coat and polished leather gloves immediately. Dad? She whispered quietly. That is her. Caleb wiped his hands with a rag before walking slowly toward the front of the garage. Vivien stepped closer. For the first time in years, she seemed uncertain how to begin a conversation. Mr. Mercer, she said carefully. Caleb nodded once. Ms. Holloway. The sound of her own name in his voice unsettled her more than she expected. Calm. Controlled. No bitterness at all. That somehow felt worse. Vivien glanced briefly around the garage. Old tools. Stained concrete. Heating vents rattling softly overhead. Then her eyes drifted toward the back hallway where the storage room sat hidden beyond the private sign. I saw the transport records, she said quietly. Caleb did not react. Then you know where the engines went. Vivien lowered her voice further. I do not think I know everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snow tapped softly against the windows, while Sophie watched silently from the folding table nearby. Then Caleb turned and walked toward the back hallway without saying a word. Vivien followed him. The storage room felt colder than the garage itself. 5 pale blue filing cabinets lined the walls beneath fluorescent lighting. Vivien stopped moving the moment she saw them. Thousands of folders. Thousands. Dates carefully labeled by year. Engine codes organized by batch number. Photographs. Repair diagrams. Failure analyses. Handwritten notes. She opened one drawer slowly and removed a folder at random. Inside sat photographs from 7 years earlier showing heat fractures nearly identical to the Indianapolis fire. Another folder contained customer complaint reports never filed publicly. Another contained internal serial numbers matching vehicles still on the road. Vivien looked back toward Caleb slowly. You documented all of this. Caleb leaned lightly against the cabinet beside him. Every engine they brought me. For 10 years. 11. Vivien stared at the endless rows of folders while the reality settled over her piece by piece. Not one hidden defect. Not one isolated cover-up. A system. A decade-long system. Why did you keep all this? She asked quietly. Caleb looked toward the television visible through the cracked storage room door, where reporters continued discussing another engine fire outside St. Louis. Then he answered in the same calm voice he had used all evening. Because eventually somebody was going to pretend they never knew. The first federal investigators arrived at Holloway Motors headquarters the following morning, just before 8 o'clock, carrying black briefcases and expressions too serious for public relations teams to manipulate. News helicopters circled above downtown Chicago before sunrise, while reporters crowded behind police barricades outside the main entrance waiting for statements nobody inside the building was ready to give. By noon, Holloway stock had dropped another 23%. Employees who once walked confidently through the lobby now avoided eye contact entirely. Some carried cardboard boxes. Others simply stared at their phones in silence, watching retirement accounts disappear by the minute. On the 42nd floor, Vivien Holloway stood at the head of the boardroom table while federal auditors connected external drives to Holloway Motors servers 1 floor below. Nobody interrupted her anymore. Nobody argued. Fear had stripped the performance out of the room completely. Martin Graves sat near the end of the table looking older than he had 48 hours earlier. Not weaker, just exposed. Vivien placed a thick folder down in front of him. Caleb Mercer's records. 11 years of them. You told this company the defect was statistically insignificant, she said quietly. Martin kept his eyes on the folder without touching it. At the time, based on available projections, that was accurate. Vivien's voice remained calm. 73 undocumented failures are not projections. A long silence followed. Several executives stared down at the table instead of looking at either of them. Finally, Martin leaned back slowly. Do you know what would have happened if we halted production back then? Vivien did not answer. The company would have collapsed. Investors would have pulled financing. Plants would have closed. Thousands of workers would have lost everything. So you buried it. I contained it. Vivien looked toward the snow-covered skyline outside the glass walls of the boardroom. You buried it inside family vehicles. Martin's composure cracked slightly for the first time. You inherited a stable company because of the decisions I made. No, Vivien said quietly. I inherited a delayed disaster. Down in Dunbar, Caleb Mercer stood beneath the hood of an old sedan, replacing a worn radiator hose, while Sophie sorted sockets beside him with grease smudged lightly across her sleeve. The garage. Television showed live footage from Chicago where reporters now described Holloway Motors as one of the largest corporate scandals in modern automotive history. Sophie looked up from the toolbox. Are they going to arrest people? Caleb tightened the hose clamp carefully before answering. Probably. Do you feel good about that? Caleb paused for a second. No, Sophie frowned slightly. Why not? He wiped his hands slowly with the same old gray rag. Because when things break this badly, everybody loses something. Before Sophie could respond, headlights swept across the garage windows. A dark government sedan rolled into the parking lot. 2 federal investigators stepped out carrying leather cases through the falling snow. Caleb watched them approach without surprise. One of the men entered the garage first and removed his gloves politely. Mr. Mercer? Caleb nodded once. Special Agent Daniel Reeves. Department of Transportation Investigative Division. The second investigator glanced briefly around the garage before noticing the television coverage overhead. We were told you may possess documentation connected to the HX engine failures. Caleb looked toward the back hallway leading to the storage room. Sophie followed his eyes silently. Agent Reeves lowered his voice. Mr. Mercer, we believe Holloway Motors concealed critical safety data for over a decade. Caleb remained still for several seconds. Then he finally spoke. They did. The investigators exchanged a quick glance. Agent Reeves opened his briefcase and removed a legal evidence form. If what we were told is accurate, he said carefully, This may become one of the largest engineering fraud investigations in the country. Caleb looked past him through the garage windows where snow drifted beneath the streetlights outside. Then he thought about every late-night engine delivery, every hidden envelope, every folder stored quietly in blue filing cabinets while the rest of the world kept driving vehicles nobody warned them about. Finally, he stepped toward the hallway and reached for the storage room door. "You should probably sit down first," he said quietly. 3 months later, the Holloway Motors Tower no longer looked untouchable. Half the executive floor sat dark at night now. Entire departments emptied after federal subpoenas, investor withdrawals, and emergency restructuring agreements tore through the company faster than anyone thought possible. News anchors stopped calling it a temporary crisis weeks ago. Now they called it what it was: collapse. Martin Graves resigned before formal charges were announced, though nobody inside the industry believed resignation had been his choice. Congressional hearings followed. Internal emails surfaced. Hidden transport records matched Caleb Mercer's files line for line. Every buried report, every unauthorized engine transfer, every ignored thermal warning. The blue filing cabinets from a small garage in Dunbar became the center of one of the largest engineering investigations in the country. But Caleb Mercer never appeared on television. He refused every interview request. He ignored every reporter who parked outside the garage hoping for a statement. Every morning, he still opened Mercer Auto Repair at 6:30 sharp. Every evening, he still locked the front door before dinner with Sophie. Some things never changed, even while entire corporations fell apart. Winter slowly gave way to early spring across Ohio. Snow disappeared from the roads. Rain replaced it instead. On a quiet Thursday evening, Caleb stood beneath the hood of an old blue pickup adjusting timing valves while soft country music played from the radio near the office window. Sophie sat nearby, finishing a school project with colored markers spread across the desk. The television was off for once. No reporters. No stock prices. Just the steady sound of tools against metal and rain tapping softly against the roof overhead. Then headlights swept across the garage floor. Caleb glanced toward the parking lot as a black sedan rolled quietly to a stop outside the service bay. No security vehicles followed it this time. No assistants. Vivien Holloway stepped out alone wearing a dark coat with rainwater collecting along the shoulders. She looked different now. Not weaker, just quieter. Like somebody who had spent months carrying the full weight of every decision made before she understood the cost of them. Sophie looked up immediately. "Dad," she whispered softly. Caleb set the wrench down beside the engine and wiped his hands with the old gray rag before walking toward the front of the garage. Vivien stopped just inside the service bay while rain echoed faintly behind her outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt different now. Not hostile, just honest. Vivien looked around the garage slowly before her eyes settled on the old pickup Caleb had been repairing. "You are still fixing engines," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once. "Somebody should." The corner of Vivien's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. Her eyes drifted towards Sophie working at the desk nearby. "How is business?" Caleb glanced around the garage. "Busy." Vivien lowered her gaze for a second before speaking again. "I came to tell you the final settlement agreement passed this morning. Compensation funds for every affected family." Caleb said nothing. "Your documentation made that possible." He leaned lightly against the pickup fender. "The documentation should not have been necessary." Vivien nodded slowly because there was nothing honest she could say against that. Rain continued tapping softly against the roof while the old garage heater rattled in the background. Finally, Vivien looked toward the engine resting beneath the hood of the pickup. "What is wrong with it?" Caleb glanced at the truck. "Timing issue. Can it be fixed?" Caleb reached for the